Hi there, my name is David Schwartz, and thank you for watching my CGT 2021 poster video. Did you know that 1 in 250 people have superpowers and they don't even know it? Well, turning 64 for me has been a watershed year in many ways. One of the biggest gifts I've gotten this year, in fact, was being diagnosed with a syndrome formerly known as Asperger's. Today it's called Level 1 Autism Spectrum Disorder, or L1-ASC. I'm just going to call it Asperger's if you don't mind. Now, autism itself is a genetic neurological disorder that's present at birth, but it doesn't usually manifest for a few years, although a delayed onset of speech is common. It tends to be studied more in children than in adults. Virtually nobody who was born prior to 1990 has ever been evaluated for Asperger's, let alone diagnosed with it. So if you are over 30, chances are you or someone you're close to has Asperger's and doesn't know it. As a result, you or they may have been wrestling with symptoms that look a lot like ADD, OCD, dyslexia, schizophrenia, and a few other things, but there are very significant differences. Now I'm going to spend a few minutes going over 4 different views of Asperger's that I hope are going to be particularly helpful or interesting to you. One is how I discovered my condition, then who should care about Asperger's and why, Asperger's and empathy, and finally Asperger's and intelligence. So please sit back and enjoy my short presentation. How I discovered my condition. Well, my interest in Asperger's began over a conversation with my sister and some of her friends. They were discussing their kids who were regarded as gifted students. And they were talking about some of the other issues their kids had, like ADD, ADHD, OCD, dyslexia, things like that. I kind of blurted out, well, if they knew what they know today back when I was in school, I probably would have been diagnosed with ADD. My sister responded, no, Dave, you'd be diagnosed with Asperger's. You've got classic symptoms. I'm like, huh? I may have heard of the term before, but I really had no idea what it was, other than it had something to do with autism. And that started me on a journey that led me to get diagnosed with Asperger's in early January. Since then, the most common question I've gotten when I mention it is, oh, how do you feel about that? When I hear them ask, when I hear that, what I hear is they ask whether there's something wrong with me, as if my brain was scrambled up or something. Actually, I feel great about it. That's because this discovery has explained a whole bunch of odd stuff from my past, all the way back to childhood. A lot of very strange experiences and interactions with people that made no sense at the time, that seemed random and disconnected from anything. Now, I've studied a lot of Landmark's work, and Landmark is all about distinguishing things in your past. This diagnosis gave me the biggest distinction I have ever gotten. Something that has been hiding just out of sight, that has been in my life since birth. Distinguishing this has left me with more power, freedom, and self-expression than anything else I've ever learned about myself. And it helped me realize that I've spent a ton of time and energy through most of my life devising strategies to avoid occurring to people as weird or different. And these are 2 things I've heard people say to me since childhood. And in spite of all those efforts, these strategies never fooled anybody. They never worked. So the net result has been that I've been burying a lot of my natural self-expression for most of my life. Hey, now I'm free. It's really a lot nicer. So who should care about this and why? Well, researchers estimate that about 1 in every 250 people have this condition, which is about 0.4% of the population. And since the late 90s, children between the ages of 4 and 10 have been getting screened in elementary school, but most adults since then have never been tested. Now, you probably fall into one or more of the following 3 categories. A, you may have Asperger's and don't know it. B, someone you're close to may have Asperger's, and neither of you know it. And C, you're just curious about it, and for whatever reason, you want to learn more. And that's cool. Now, Asperger's tends to affect more males than females for whatever reason, and it can really screw up relationships. That's because Aspies, as many like to be called, have trouble reading people. Okay, we don't take hints very well. Some Aspies have a really hard time dealing with analogies, metaphors, and similes. For example, telling an Aspie to cool down when they're throwing a tantrum or alluding to an elephant in the room, it might not make a lot of sense to them. They tend to be very literal. Now, I'm good with analogies, but I am very literal. In fact, at some point in college, I started telling people that, as I was getting to know them, that I'm a very literal person, and I take them at their word. You know, I don't think it ever registered very well. You know, what ended up happening was bullies would take that as an invitation to play tricks on me, and I was often seen as a nerdy guy who'd fall for all kinds of practical jokes. Yeah, of course, this led to all sorts of trust issues, which for me started around 4th grade. But trust issues are also a common problem for people who have had Asperger's, and as well as being bullied. Now, when I was in college, I went on some dates and sometimes said things that seemed totally innocuous. You know, a few minutes later, my date would go to the bathroom and then just disappear. And later, I found out they were offended at something I said that, you know, they thought I said, not what I said, but how they heard it. And then they just went home. I never did figure out what ever went on with that. Now, for women who expect that there are things that men should just know or be able to pick up on from hints, let me tell you, men with Asperger's will never meet your expectations in that respect. If you're married to somebody like that, get them tested for Asperger's. They may resist, but you know what? You need to stress that it's to see if they have some really great abilities or superpowers that are holding them back in their life, rather than focusing on the problems. And I'm going to discuss these abilities shortly. After a while, it became common for people to ask me, why are you so weird? Why can't you just go along with the rest of the group? Why do you always have to be different? You know, they're all going out for pizza, and I'm like, oh, I feel like burritos. You know, come on. Aspies tend to be antisocial because, well, most normal people can be really hard for us to understand in social situations. Now I want to talk about Asperger's and empathy. People with Asperger's are said to lack empathy and have a poor ability to get into other people's worlds. Now, I can't speak for anybody else, but I literally have so much going on inside of my own head that the last thing in the world I want to do is try getting into somebody else's head and figure out how they see the world. No freaking way. All right? I can't deal with all the noise going on in my own head most of the time. That said, I do have the ability to empathize with others. It actually takes some concentration and effort on my part, and I've gotten pretty good at it. But it's not anywhere near an automatic thing that I think most people have the ability to do. Something my father used to tell me since I was really young was that I was selfish. He'd say, you think the world revolves around you. Well, yeah, I did back then. Although it was probably because as a child I had no ability to empathize with others. My head was filled with thoughts and feelings and sensations coming from my own body, and you know, sometimes it just was overwhelming. Over the years I've learned to quiet it down, but it was really years before I was able to begin feeling others. The long-term effect of this is that I'm often perceived as self-centered, aloof, and even somewhat narcissistic. Yeah, at least this is how it appears from the outside. From inside of my own head, I am just not interested in expending the effort it takes to be out there with others and to try and understand what they're going through. If it looks familiar to something I've experienced, well, that helps a lot. But in general, especially for people much different than me, it can be incredibly hard to relate. So I just usually don't even try. For example, I don't have kids. Right? There's no way I would even pretend to understand what it's like being a parent. That's just how it occurs to me. And this is how the Asperger's brain works. It's how we're wired. Okay? Asperger's and intelligence. So now I want to get into one of the more interesting aspects of Asperger's that has to do with how our brains are wired and how we think and reason. Consider this. As a self-conscious being, you and me, right? We come into the world and we experience it however we experience it. But there's this assumption, right, we all make as we're growing up, and it has us believe that however the world occurs to us, it's probably the same for everybody else, right? What we see is green, you see is green. What I see is blue, you see is blue, right? When I hear a cat meow, you hear a cat meow. Now, the thing is, for years I suffered mightily trying to make sense of things people would tell me in response to things I'd ask. They try to explain things so patiently, and I could not make heads or tails of what they were talking about half the time. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s before I realized that I really think differently than most other people. Now, one thing I got curious about shortly after my diagnosis was the relationship between Asperger's and IQ. I searched the web and found some really interesting results of studies published in 2015-ish. In the world of measuring IQ, you might know that the average IQ score is defined as 100. That means something like half of all humans have an IQ between 97 and 103, something like that. Well, the average IQ of everybody on the autism spectrum is considered as below average, right? Or under 100. Somewhere around 90 or so, I think. A lot of people with autism are really mentally impaired. So if you know anything about this, it shouldn't be terribly surprising. However, the average IQ of people diagnosed with Asperger's who are on the spectrum have IQs above 125, which puts them right around or within genius bracket. It's kind of weird. It's this characteristic of Asperger's that has made it difficult for researchers over the years to even agree whether it belongs on the autism spectrum or not. At the end of the day, they decided it does belong there because a bunch of other common behavioral and cognitive traits that are unique to those with autism show up in people with Asperger's. So to be sure, people with high IQ often have some pretty quirky personality traits, right? You probably know a few of them. But they may not be related to those on the autism spectrum. By most accounts, people believe that Albert Einstein probably had Asperger's as well as Nikola Tesla. Not because of their mental abilities, but because of their challenges in dealing with other people, how they dealt with the world, and challenges shared with those on the autism spectrum. Now, there are a bunch of distinct mental reasoning categories that are measured individually when you get tested for autism. Things like auditory, visual, verbal, spatial, etc. Aspies tend to be off the chart in one or more of these categories. Like, I'm above the 99th percentile in verbal reasoning and 93rd percentile in spatial reasoning. I'm also pretty high in visual as well. So let's look at how the Aspie brain is wired for a minute. One thing the researchers have learned about Aspies is that our brains are not wired the same as others. But they're not simply wired in a bunch of different ways. In fact, they tend to be miswired in the same way. And that is really unusual. In fact, Aspies tend to have the ability to see things from a 10,000-foot level far more easily than most. In fact, it can sometimes be confused with being highly intuitive or even having psychic powers. Now, I find it very natural and easy to move back and forth between this high-level perspective and ground level, so to speak, and everywhere in between. This is what I would call a superpower that most Aspies have. Now, be aware that this superpower actually has a side effect that can be very annoying to other people. And those people often describe it as a tendency to overanalyze things. Now, there's a very subtle difference there that most people don't understand. This took me a while to figure it out. Now, if people have accused you or someone you know of overanalyzing things a lot, when you or they seem to come by it naturally, it may be due to Asperger's. See, analyzing things takes a certain amount of effort for most folks. For example, standing on the ground in some open area of land, it can take quite a bit of effort to get a sense of the overall terrain. You know, if there's a lot of vegetation, uneven ground, maybe some water flowing through, right? But if you're in a balloon 1,000 feet above looking down, there's no analysis there. It's just you look and that's what you see. That is, no analysis was performed. You didn't have to think about it. You just opened your eyes and looked. Now, this isn't really practical in the physical world, so it doesn't show up there much, but it's very common for people who work in virtual world issues like software, different engineering disciplines, law, building architecture, chemistry, things that you work on in your head. All right? As a software developer myself, I'm constantly getting called out for overanalyzing things when I'm simply reporting what I see in my head while we're discussing different design options. The problem is, most of the other people there cannot see what I see in my head. It would take them a lot of analysis to figure out what shows up almost instantly inside of my head. What amazes me is that people get pissed off and tell me to shut up when I'm trying to warn them of potential problems that I see. So it's frustrating, and as you learn about some of these things, you learn to deal with them better. But this is how the Asperger's mind works for a lot of us. Used properly, it's a superpower. Unfortunately, my experience so far is that it's seen more as an annoyance than anything else. But since I've been diagnosed, it really helps me to see these things and recognize them, and I'm slowly working at turning it more into a superpower. And that's all in how we deal with other people. And by distinguishing Asperger's in my life, I'm able to start turning that around. So thank you very much, and I hope this has been informative for you. Bye.